There was once a house known as the Old White House that used to stand by the side of the road, close to where you say the horse first took fright. Some people of the name of Halkett, relations of dear old Sir Arthur Halkett, a great friend of ours, used to live there. The house, it was popularly believed, had been built on the site of an ancient burial ground. Everyone used to say it was haunted, and the Halketts had great trouble in getting servants. The appearance of the haunted house did not belie its reputation, for its grey walls, sombre garden, gloomy hall, dark passages and staircase, and sinister-looking attics could not have been more thoroughly suggestive of all kinds of ghostly phenomena. Moreover, the whole atmosphere of the place, no matter how hot and bright the sun, was cold and dreary, and it was a constant source of wonder to everyone how Lady Halkett could live there. She was, however, always cheerful, and used to tell me that nothing would induce her to leave a spot dear to so many generations of her family, and associated with the happiest recollections in her life. She was very fond of company, and there was scarcely a week in the year in which she had not someone staying with her. I can only remember her as a widow, her husband, a major in the Gordon Highlanders, having died in India before I was born. She had 2 daughters, Margaret and Alice, both considered very handsome, but some years older than I. The difference in age, however, did not prevent her being on very friendly terms, and I was constantly invited to their house, in the summer to croquet and archery, and winter to balls. Like most elderly ladies of that period, Lady Halkett was very fond of cards, and she and my mother used frequently to play bezique and cribbage, whilst the girls and I indulged in something rather more frivolous. On those occasions the carriage always came for us at 10, since my mother, for some reason or other, I had a shrewd suspicion it was an account of the alleged haunting, would never return home after that time. When she accepted an invitation to a ball, it was always conditionally that Lady Halkett would put us both up for the night, and the carriage used then to come for us on the following day, after 1 o'clock luncheon. I shall never forget the last time I went to a dance at the Old White House, though it is now rather more than 50 years ago. My mother had not been very well for some weeks, having, so she thought, taken cold internally. She had not had a doctor, partly because she did not feel ill enough, and partly because the only medical man near us was an apothecary, whose skill she had a very poor opinion. My mother had quite made up her mind to accompany me to the ball, but at the last moment, the weather being appalling, she yielded to advice, and my Aunt Nora, who happened to be staying with us at the time, chaperoned me instead. It was snowing when we set out, and it snowed all through the night and most of the next day. The roads were completely blocked, and we had to remain at the Old White House from Monday evening until the following Thursday. Aunt Nora and I occupied separate bedrooms, and mine was at the end of a long passageway along from everyone else's. Prior to this, my mother and I had always shared a room, the only really pleasant one, so I thought, in the house overlooking the front lawn. But on the occasion there being a number of visitors, belated like ourselves, we had to squeeze in rooms, my aunt liking a room to herself. It was natural that she should be allotted the largest and most comfortable. Consequently, she was domiciled in the wing where all the other visitors slept, while I was forced to retreat to a passage on the other side of the house, where, with the exception of my apartment, there were none other than lumber rooms. All went smoothly and happily, and nothing interrupted the harmony of our visit till the night before we returned home. We had had supper. Our meals were differently arranged in those days, and Margaret and I were ascending the staircase on our way to bed when Alice, who had run upstairs ahead of us, met us with a scared face. "Oh, do come to my room," she cried. "Something has happened to Mary." Mary was one of the housemaids. We both accompanied her, and on entering her room, found Mary seated on a chair, sobbing hysterically. One only had to glance at the girl to see that she was suffering from some very severe shock. Though normally red-cheeked and placid and short and very healthy, stolid creature, and the last person to be easily perturbed, she was now without a vestige of colour, whilst the pupils of her eyes were dilated with terror, and her entire body, from the crown of her head to the soles of her feet, shook as if with ague. I was immeasurably shocked to see her. "Why, Mary," Margaret exclaimed, "whatever is the matter? What has happened?" "It's the candle, miss," the girl gasped. "The candle in Miss Trevor's room. I can't put it out." "You can't put it out? Why, what nonsense," Margaret said. "Are you mad?" "It is as true as I sit here, miss," Mary panted. "I put the candle in the mantelpiece while I set the room to rights, and when I'd finished and came to blow it out, I couldn't. I blew and blew and blew, and it didn't have any effect. And then I grew afraid, miss, horribly afraid." And here she buried her face in her hands and shuddered. "I've never been frightened like this before, miss," she returned slowly, "and have come away and left the candle burning." "How absurd of you," Margaret scolded. "We must go and put it out at once. I have a good mind to make you come with us, Mary. But there, stay where you are. For goodness sake, stop crying, and everyone in the house will hear you." So saying, Margaret hurried off, Alice and I accompanying her. And on arriving outside my room, the door of which was wide open, we perceived the lighted candle standing in the position Mary had described. I looked at the girls, and perceived, in spite of my endeavours not to perceive it, and the unmistakable signs of great fear of something they suspected, but dared not name, lurking in the corners of their eyes. "Who will go first?" Margaret demanded. No one spoke. "Well then," she continued, "I will." And suiting the action to the word, she stepped over the threshold. The moment she did so, the door began to close. "This is curious," she cried. "Push!" We did. We all three pushed, but despite our efforts, the door came resolutely to, and we were shut out. Then, before we had time to recover from our astonishment, it flew open. But before we could cross the threshold, it came violently to in the same manner as before. Some unseen force held it against us. "Let us make one more effort," Margaret said, "and if we don't succeed, we will call for help." Obeying her instructions, we once again pushed. I was nearest the handle, and in some manner, how, none of us could ever explain, just as the door opened of its own accord, I slipped and fell inside. The door then closed immediately with a bang, and to my unmitigated horror I found myself alone in the room. For some seconds I was spellbound, and could not even collect my thoughts sufficiently to frame a reply to the piteous entreaties of the Halketts, who kept banging the door, imploring me to tell them what was happening. Never in the hideous excitement of nightmare had I experienced such terror as the terror that room conveyed to my mind. Though nothing was to be seen, nothing but the candle, the light of which was peculiarly white and vibrating, I felt the presence of something inexpressibly menacing and horrible. It was in the light, the atmosphere, the furniture, everywhere. On all sides it surrounded me. On all sides I was threatened in a manner that was strange and deadly, something suggesting to me that the source of evil originated in the candle, and that if I could succeed in extinguishing the candle, I should free myself from the ghostly presence. I advanced towards the mantelpiece, and drawing a deep breath, blew with the energy born of desperation. It had no effect. I repeated my efforts. I blew frantically, madly, but all to no purpose. The candle still burned softly and mockingly. Then a fearful terror seized me, and flying to the opposite side of the room, I buried my face against the wall and waited for what sickly beatings of my heart warned me was coming. Constrained to look, I slightly, only very slightly, moved around, and there, floating stealthily towards me through the air, came the candle, the vibrating, glowing, baleful candle. I hid my face again and prayed God to let me faint. Nearer and nearer drew the light, wilder and wilder the wrenches at the door. Closer and closer I pressed myself to the wall. And then when the final throes of agony were more than the human heart and brain could stand, there came the suspicion, the suggestion of a touch. of a touch so horrid that my prayers were at last answered, and I fainted. When I recovered, I was in Margaret's room, and half a dozen well-known forms were gathered round me. It appears that, with the collapse of my body on the floor, the door that had so effectually resisted every effort to turn the handle immediately flew open, and I was discovered lying on the ground with the candle, still alight, on the ground beside me. My aunt experienced no difficulty in blowing out the refractory candle, and I was carried with the greatest tenderness to the other wing of the house, where I slept that night. Little was said about the incident next day, but all who knew of it expressed in their faces the utmost anxiety, an anxiety which, now that I had recovered, greatly puzzled me. On our return home, another shock awaited me. We found to our dismay that my mother was seriously ill, and that the doctor who had been sent from Perth the previous evening, just about the time of her adventure with the candle, had stated that she might not survive the day. His warning was fulfilled. She died at sunset. Her death, of course, may have had nothing at all to do with the candle episode, yet it struck me then as an odd coincidence, and seems all the more strange to me after hearing your account of the bowl that touched dear father in the road, so near the spot where the Halkett's house once stood. I could never discover whether Lady Halkett or her daughters ever saw anything of a superphysical nature in their house. After my experience, they were always very reticent on the subject, and naturally I did not like to press it. On Lady Halkett's death, Margaret and Alice sold the house, which was eventually pulled down as no one would live in it, and I believe the ground on which you stood is now a turnip field. That, my dear, is all I can tell you. Now, Mr. O'Donnell, Miss MacDonald added, having heard our experiences, my mother's and mine, what is your opinion? Do you think the phenomenon of the candle was in any way connected with the Bogle both you and I have seen, or are the hauntings of the old white house entirely separate from those of the road?